Hi, everybody. Welcome to this COVID-19 mandated distance conversation about sports and our world. I would love to have been with you today to discuss these concepts in person, in class, and I'll give you my email address at the end of the session here if you want to reach out and ask questions. I know you've got some readings and some other things that are germane to our conversation today, but because of that, I want to just sort of focus on one topic, which is where sports and globalization interact, particularly where countries and organizations can decide to use sports to particular ends. And so I'm going to call that sports space. It's a concept coined by some sociologists about 15 years ago that tries to sort of measure the value of sports to enough people that when you aggregate that collective value, it gives you opportunities to do different things than you might otherwise have done with sports. And where I want to start is with this example here of China being on the road and where sports can bring things together. So good news about soccer is that it's in the global sports space. So look at what that means again here in a moment. And it means that the Chinese can leave China and mainland China and go play their sport all kinds of places. It's different than what they might be able to do with another very popular Chinese sport, badminton, which does not have a huge following around the world. And so they can't really go out and compete in countries and places around in the same way because it's a peculiar sport to East Asia. But with soccer, they can. But it also gives people who want to make a point to the Chinese multiple opportunities to make that point. This is a couple of pictures that a friend of mine took at an exhibition game that the Chinese national team played in Utah a few years ago. And so when the Chinese team came to play, good news they could come to play in Utah because soccer's common in both mainland China all over the place and in Utah, that people could come out and protest China's policies in regards to Tibet. These are Tibetan flags on the right. And that gives a venue to make that protest that otherwise would not exist. So you have this ability to have cultural exchanges, to have sporting exchanges, to have countries sort of recognizing each other through this platform, but it also gives other people a chance to say, hey, wait a minute, I have a point to make too. And they can't really control much of that, though in this case, the Chinese threatened to leave the field if the Tibetan protesters weren't removed, but it does create a dynamic that's interesting. But it ties largely into this concept called sports space. So what those sociologists were trying to measure is whether you could, whether it was infinite or finite, the amount of care people would give to a sport. Now, this is different than liking watching or enjoying participating. This is trying to see, are there things that people have in common sporting wise that will help them vote differently, spend their money differently, believe things differently? Like, can you motivate people to do something through the sport? And the ability of that to manifest on an individual level is vast, or even on a national level is vast, or a region. So here's three examples here. This picture on the left is of a game called Gaelic football. This is the most popular sport in Ireland. It's an Irish national sport, the way that American football is here, or Australian rules football is in Australia. The problem with that is that it doesn't translate well outside the country. So you can't really politicize the sport between Ireland and other countries if you use Gaelic football because it's only the Irish really who play. Similar to NASCAR racing in the American Southeast. There's other parts of the country certainly that care a lot about it, but it doesn't translate as well. So if you're trying to do something with NASCAR, your reach is limited compared to what it might be if you're using American football. This other example is distance skiing, which has some applications in certain countries where winter is very common. There was a super popular female a distance skier in Estonia who was the most popular Estonian athlete for a while. That was a cool thing, but it was limited by sort of the duration of her career and in Estonia. So that was something where people had a care about it, and you could motivate them to do something, but it either was limited by national borders, regional applications, or even the career of an athlete. In my own case, you could see sports space coming to matter when I would motivate myself to do something. For example, when the state of Washington was running a ballot initiative to build the Seahawks a new stadium, and it was going to fail, and I was going to vote no until they rewrote the stadium plans to include soccer. Soccer happens to be part of my sports space in a way that I care deeply about it, and I will be motivated to do things I might not otherwise do, including vote to tax myself and my fellow Washingtonians if we had a stadium that could accommodate World Cup games. And I got my fingers crossed that in 2026, that long-term game of taxing myself to be able to go to a World Cup game in my home state will pay off. But it's that motivational thing that matters. In the United States, our sports space filled not with one thing, but with three things. And it's because of the geographic size and the diversity of weather that dominates this. Many other countries end up with one sport in their space because the geography permits the same sport to be played where everyone lives, or the weather does. So soccer in Central America, say, doesn't have to be supplemented by another sport because you can play soccer year round in everywhere where the population basically lives, so it works. In the United States, that wasn't true for baseball. There's a weather dynamic that applies, hence basketball emerging. There's Michaela Ferenz, who was part of the Splash Sisters. Hey, if you want to go see a sport at UI that's fun to watch and really competitive, go watch the women's basketball team. Then the other sport that ends up with a peculiar sports space is football, American football, which actually comes out of colleges, not the pros. The pro game grows out of the college game. And because we have university sports that look and act differently than any other university sporting system in the world, we have this additional space where sports sort of grows up. But those are still fairly unique things to us. The shared spaces sit in largely a quartet of sports: soccer, cricket, rugby, and to a much lesser extent, baseball. But there is baseball in multiple parts of the world, so it gets a thing. Hockey is much more limited because there's got to be enough snow and ice for it to even develop there. But it probably is competitive with baseball for the number of places it's played. So these sports are ones where if you're trying to make a political statement and you're trying to tie countries together, it might be easier to use these sports than it is to use the more regional ones, like American football, or like squash, or like many others that are similar that have adherents, but not enough to rise to a national level and then be in multiple national sports spaces, shared spaces at the same time. So you'd be surprised that the Olympics and other big events don't always work as well as individual sports. And that's because it's hard for nations to be competitive at the Olympics. If you ever look at a medal table, you'll see that there's only a few countries winning loads of medals, and then others winning a handful. And so there are some countries that are using the Olympics to be competitive with each other. So those would be the ones where they're trying to win, like the whole event, the medal table, the most golds, the most medals, etc. But others are trying to they're trying to show that they belong and exist. And events, global events that matter, provide that sort of framework. So two different examples here, different extremes would be Tonga at the last couple of Olympics, where the most important part of the Olympics for Tonga wasn't a competitive event. It was actually the Parade of Nations, where the country came in, was able to show their flag. They were became famous because their athlete who carried the flag came in wearing a traditional Tongan skirt, oiled up, looking amazing, and he trended around the world, and millions more people looked up Tonga on web searches in the next week. On the other side is the United States, which is using the Olympics to try and compete, right? We're trying to win the whole darn thing. And so some of that is just winning the most events or the best events. So one of the best events is considered the decathlon, which is 10 events in one. This athlete here, I hope you know who he is. His name's Dan O'Brien. And of the handful of athletes who've ever won a decathlon gold medal, one of them's a Vandal, and it's Dan O'Brien, who won the decathlon as the world's best athlete in 1996. He's the one for whom the Dan O'Brien track and field complex is named. It's a big damn deal that we have a decathlon winner here. Events should also be buttressed. I don't have a slide for it, but individuals. So a sport might not matter, but you can have a transcendent individual, or you can have a sport where you don't need a team to compete. For example, it's hard to have the best rugby team in the world for a small country. It's one reason why Fiji, for example, is the dominant country in a smaller scale rugby team event called rugby sevens instead of 15 because they have the best 7 athletes, but it's hard for them to have the best 15. But if you have individual events like track and field or swimming, or you could have a boxer or an MMA fighter or a judoka or a tennis player who could become transcendent and the whole country sort of rallies around. I'm thinking of something like Manny Pacquiao, a Philippine boxer who's the most important figure in the Philippines, arguably even more important than the president. And so those operate a little bit differently, events and individuals, which can become transcendent. So let's move to the third point here because we only got about 4.5 minutes late. The third point is that sports are interesting tools politically for two related concepts. The first is called détente. So détente is a French word that basically means the easing of tensions, the coming together of countries or people or teams or cities or something where they're at odds and they have this conflict, but you're going to come together in some way, and sports can be that way. This is a great cartoon of this is Lady Liberty and Confucius playing ping pong together over a net that says diplomacy. And it's representative of something that happened in the early 1970s called ping pong diplomacy, where this sport that's important in China was bridged by a hippie American young guy and a really distinguished Chinese ping pong athlete, a table tennis player. And that the Chinese premier Mao Zedong took advantage of it because he saw an opportunity to rebuild a relationship that was terrible from the end of World War II, from 1949, really the end of the Chinese Revolution until then. And the quote is, let the little ball move the big ball. You can use sports to move those things along and have you be friendlier. Like one of the main ways that the United States and Iran have maintained relations since 1979 up to today is wrestling exchanges. Greco-Roman and other modern forms of wrestling, very important in Iran. Our athletes go there regularly. They're very popular. It leads to important kinds of cultural exchanges and humanizes each other just a little bit. But the sports can also provide continued conflict because of the tensions that arise. And if enough people care, then you can have that conflict be rehashed regularly. This is an example of the conflict between England specifically. That's another side story. Why is there an England in soccer and rugby when there's no England at the United Nations? There's a United Kingdom, but no England. The United Kingdom fought Argentina for control of the Falkland Islands. Actually, Argentina fought. They invaded the Falklands to try and take them from the UK. The two teams have played subsequently many times in the World Cup, including a very famous match 5 years after the war when Argentina won on its way to the title when their star player Diego Maradona punched the ball into the net with his hand, which you may not know anything about soccer. You probably know you're not supposed to use your hands. But he got away with it. It was in an era before lots of replay cameras, the referees couldn't see it. It's a famous moment, and they've played several times in big matches since then. They're bitter, ugly, vitriolic matches that lead to continue the conflict and bring it back up regularly. So that's another issue. There may be détente, there may be continued conflict. The reality is, though, that political extremes take advantage of this. One of the most heinous stories of the last 15 years or so in sports is the way Saddam Hussein in Iraq, who had turned the sporting federations over to his son Uday, treated their athletes. They were tortured, they were imprisoned, they were treated really terribly, essentially because a failure at sports was considered a betrayal of Saddam Hussein. And since he held all the power, things went poorly for athletes who did poorly. Similar thing today in North Korea. North Korea mandates that their teams win. If they don't win, then lousy things happen to coaches and players. But here are groups from both the left and the right political extremes who try to take advantage of this, either to give messages internally to keep their people happy, even though things stink in their country, or to convince the rest of the world that things aren't so bad and or they're succeeding, so it can't be really that terrible. So on the left, you have the Soviets of antiquity and this group calisthenics, and the Cubans of more recent vintage. On the right, you have Nazi Germany, which is a very rightist sort of regime, and the Argentine military dictatorship of the 70s, still relatively common. But they're going to use it because sports space operates both at home and abroad. So we have lots of ways that this stuff comes together. We have lots of ways that this stuff comes together. There's all kinds of ways we could explore sports and international relations. I teach a pretty fun class called IS 350 on this very topic. But we can continue to talk about sports space or any other avenue of this you want. There's my email, bill@uidaho.edu. Go Vandals. Let's chat.